In the fall of 1888, on a wind-scoured bench of the Wyoming Territory, north of the Sweetwater, a woman knelt in a graveyard nobody owned and counted rows of sunken earth. There were 9 of them, set out in a grid the way a cautious man lays brick, and the foreman of the old Caldwell coal camp had told her, with a kindness that wasn't kindness, to stop at the 3rd. He had said it twice. He had said it the way a man says a thing he has rehearsed. Past the 3rd row, he told her, the ground was unsound, the timbering rotten, the markers false. She had thanked him and waited until his wagon was a smudge against the brown hills, and then she had set her shovel into the 4th row. Because a man who counts your digging for you is a man with something buried in the count. Her name was Hannah Pell, and she had come to that bench with $11, a borrowed mule, and the only trade her father had ever managed to put into her hands before the lung rot took him. She did not weep for the camp or for the dead in it. She was not there to mourn. She was there to read what the ground had written and to set right a column of figures that had been wrong for 11 years. And if you have ever been told to look away from a thing precisely because it would cost someone if you looked, then you already know the shape of what she found. Stay with her a while. The ground here keeps its accounts longer than any bank. Her father had been a sexton and a stonecutter both, in a river town in Missouri, and he had taught her the 2 halves of his work as though they were one. He taught her to cut a name into granite so it would outlast the hand that paid for it, to hold the chisel at the one angle the stone would accept, and to drive it with a blow that was firm and never angry, because granite forgives a steady hand and breaks under a hasty one. He taught her to read a grave the way other men read a page, to know from the slump of the soil how deep a thing lay and how long it had lain there, to tell a true burial from a false one by the way the earth had settled or refused to settle over the years. A grave that holds a body sinks in a certain manner as the timber of the coffin gives, he told her, and a grave that holds nothing sinks in another, and a grave that holds a thing that is not a body sinks in a 3rd way that a careless eye will never catch. He had walked her through the burying ground behind his church on winter mornings and made her lay her hand on the old graves and the new and name which with her eyes shut, and he had not let her stop until she was right every time. She had not understood at 12 why a man would dig a grave to hold a thing that was not a body. She understood it now. The Caldwell camp had been a coal operation, a narrow seam worked out of the side of the bench by a company that called itself the Sweetwater Fuel and Land Concern, and it had died the way such camps died, with a cave-in and a panic and a sudden closing of the company store. That much was known to everyone on the bench. What was less known, and what had brought Hannah the better part of 400 miles, was a letter her father had received the winter before he died, from a man named Josiah Reed, who had been the camp's undertaker and gravedigger, and who had cut stone alongside her father as a young man in Missouri. The letter was short, and it was strange. It said that Josiah had buried more than men at Caldwell, that the company had made him do it, and that he could not die easy with the knowing of it. It said that the truth of the camp lay past the 3rd row, and that a stonecutter's daughter would know how to read it if ever one came. Her father had been too sick to go. He had folded the letter into his Bible and made her promise, and then he had died, and the promise had waited in her the way a seed waits. She reached the bench in the 1st week of October, when the cottonwoods along the creek had gone to copper, and the wind came down off the divide with the smell of snow, still a month away, but coming. The camp was a ruin of gray board and fallen tin. The head frame over the mine mouth had collapsed into a tangle of timber and cable, and the company store stood with its door swung wide and its shelves bare, and its ledger desk still bolted to the floor under a drift of bird dirt and dust. She didn't go to the store first. She went to the burying ground, because the burying ground was the letter's only address, and she stood at the foot of it and counted the rows, and she found 9. The foreman found her there the next morning. His name was Asa Coyle, and he had stayed on the bench after the camp closed as a watchman for the company that still held the paper on the land. A man of perhaps 60, with a face like a dried apple, and a voice that had learned to be gentle, because gentleness opened more doors than force. He looked at her shovel and her father's leather roll of tools, and he understood at once what she was, and Hannah watched the understanding cross his face and settle into a wariness he tried to hide behind courtesy. He told her the ground was unsound past the 3rd row. He told her the markers beyond it were a charity, wooden crosses set up for men whose bodies were never recovered from the cave-in, and that to dig there would be to disturb a sorrow that ought to be let lie. He told her these things well. A lesser liar would have forbidden her outright. Asa Coyle only counted the rows for her and asked her kindly to keep her work to the front of the yard. What he did not know was that Hannah had already walked the whole grid in the gray light before he came, and had knelt at every row, and had laid her bare palm against the cold soil of each, and had read them. The first 3 rows had the slow, honest slump of true graves, the earth fallen in the gentle bow that a giving coffin makes over a decade. The rows beyond did not. The 4th row and the 5th had settled hard and flat and square, the way ground settles over a box that does not rot, a box that holds its shape, a box of iron or of stone. There were no men in the back rows of the Caldwell burying ground. There was something the company had wanted the earth to keep. She let Coyle go. She let the wagon shrink into the hills. Then she took up the shovel and set it into the 4th row, and the work of the next 11 days began. The first grave gave her nothing but labor and doubt. She dug it the way her father had taught her, in a clean shaft with squared walls, lifting the soil in even courses and stacking it on a hide, so she could return every spadeful exactly as it had lain. A grave robber digs a hole. A sexton's daughter opens and closes the earth like a drawer. She went down through the frost-stiffened top, where the spade rang and skidded and took the skin off her knuckles, and then into the clay below, where the work changed and became slow and sucking, each spadeful clinging to the iron and needing to be knocked free against the shaft wall. She measured her depth against the haft of the shovel, a notch cut every foot, and she rested at each foot, not from weakness but from method, because a tired arm cuts a crooked wall and a crooked wall tells you nothing about how the ground was first disturbed. At 4 feet her shovel rang on wood, and her heart climbed and then sank, because the wood was only a lid of rough planking laid flat with nothing beneath it but more clay. A false floor, a grave dug to look like a grave, and filled to look full, with a plank set part way down so that a man probing with a rod would strike it and believe. She knelt in the cold shaft and ran her fingers along the underside of the plank and found the marks of the adze that had squared it, fresh marks, sealed away from weather, 11 years old and looking a weak cut. She understood then that she had been meant to find exactly this, that Coyle's warning about unsound ground was a truth turned inside out. The ground was not unsound. The graves were unsound. They had been built to fail an inspection and pass a glance, and the man who built them had counted on grief to keep the curious away. She closed the 4th grave as carefully as she had opened it, tamping the soil back in its courses, laying the plank where she had found it, and she moved to the 5th row, and here she changed her method. If a plank had been set to stop a probing rod, then the thing worth hiding lay below the plank, and the man who set it had counted on no one caring to dig past disappointment. So she dug past it. She went down through the false floor of the first grave in the 5th row. And below the plank, the clay had been disturbed once and packed again, and she could read the disturbance the way her father had taught her. The way packed clay holds a faint seam where two diggings meet, a line darker than the rest where water had run between the old work and the new. She followed that seam down. The shaft grew so deep that she had to throw the soil twice, once to a ledge she cut in the wall and again from the ledge to the surface, and the lamp she lowered on a cord guttered in the bad air at the bottom, so that she had to climb out and wait and let the shaft breathe. At 7 feet in the close dark with the wind moaning over the lip above her, her shovel struck iron, and the sound was not the dull knock of wood, but a hard, bright ring that ran up the haft and into her teeth, and she stopped and set the shovel aside and dug the rest with her hands. It was the corner of a strongbox, not a coffin. A freight strongbox of riveted iron plate, the kind that rode in the boot of a stagecoach or the express car of a railroad, perhaps 2 feet by 3, sunk on its side in the clay with the hasp turned down. She cleared the earth from around it with her hands until the whole of it stood revealed in the lamplight, rust-bloomed and cold, sweating the deep chill of 11 years underground, the rivets standing in rows along the seams like the stitches of a wound that would not open. She laid her palm flat against the lid and felt the cold of it come up into her arm, the cold of a thing that had not known sun or air since before she was grown. And she sat back on her heels in the bottom of a grave that held no man, and looked at a thing the Sweetwater Fuel and Land Concern had gone to great trouble to bury, where only the dead were thought to lie. She did not open it there. A box that has been buried with such care has a lock, and a lock in the bottom of a shaft is a lock worked in misery. She rigged a sling of rope and a lever from a length of the fallen head-frame timber, and she spent the better part of a day raising the box up out of the earth, hand over hand, the rope burning her palms through the rag she had wrapped them in, the box rising an inch at a time and settling and rising again, until at last it lay on the grass at the lip of the grave in the plain light of afternoon, and Hannah looked at it and felt the first cold edge of knowing what it was. Here the story might have hurried. It did not hurry. She did not break the lock that day. She walked the half-mile to the creek and washed her hands and ate the last of her bread, and she let herself understand that whatever was in the box, the camp had killed to keep it, or near enough, and that she was now the only living person who knew it had been moved. That night she slept with her father's tools rolled under her head and the box pulled into the doorway of the ruined store, and she did not sleep much. And in the morning, Asa Coyle's wagon came back over the rise, and she had time only to throw a length of canvas over the box before he reined in at the edge of the yard. He did not come close. He sat his wagon and looked at the turned earth of the 4th row and the 5th, and his dried apple face did not change, but something went out of it, some last hope that she had been an ordinary fool. He asked her in his gentle voice whether she had found the ground unsound, as he had warned. She told him she had found it very sound indeed. He looked at the canvas a long moment. Then he told her that there were men who would not want the front of the yard disturbed any more than the back, men who paid his wages, and that a young woman alone on a high bench with winter coming ought to think about the road south while the passes were open. It was the nearest he came to a threat, and it was not very near. And Hannah understood that Asa Coyle was an old man who had been made to carry another man's sin for 11 years, and had never once been thanked for it. She told him she would think about the road. She did not tell him she had already opened one of the graves a second time, with her eyes, and seen what kind of yard it truly was. When he had gone, she uncovered the box and set to the lock. It was a good lock, a cast-iron express padlock with a shrouded shackle, made to keep an honest hand out and to break a dishonest one, and a lesser hand would have taken a sledge to it and ruined whatever lay inside under a rain of broken rust. Her father had taught her better. A lock is only a puzzle made of iron, he used to say, and iron remembers the shape of the hand that made it. She cleaned the keyway first with a thread of oiled wool drawn through it again and again, until the rag came back gray instead of red, freeing the works of 11 years of rust. She filed a pick from a wagon spoke and a tension wrench from the same, the steel of an old spoke being hard enough to hold an edge and soft enough to shape, and she sat down over the box in the wind for the whole of a gray afternoon. She set the slightest turning pressure on the plug with the wrench and felt for the pins through the rust, one at a time, the rust making each of them stick and then give with a small gritted complaint. She eased each pin up to the shear line and held it there with a pressure as light as a held breath, and twice she lost the whole set when her cold fingers slipped and every pin dropped home again, and she had to begin from the first. She did not curse. She warmed her hands in her armpits and began again. When the last pin set and the plug turned under the wrench, the shackle gave with a small dead click that the wind almost took, and she sat very still for a moment, her hands aching, before she lifted the lid. The box was full of paper. Not gold, not coin. Paper, packed tight and dry, wrapped in oilcloth against the damp. And she lifted the bundles out one by one into the afternoon light and unwrapped them and began slowly to understand the size of the thing she had dug into. There were pay ledgers. There were the original land filings for the whole of the Caldwell bench, the entries and the claims of the men who had first taken up that ground. There were deeds, and bound in with the deeds, in a hand she would have known anywhere, was a long letter from Josiah Reed, the camp's gravedigger, written in the weeks before the camp closed, addressed to no one and to everyone, setting down what he had done and why. She read it sitting in the dead grass with the wind pulling at the pages, weighting each sheet with a stone as she finished it, so the wind would not take her understanding before she had it whole, and what it told her rearranged the whole of the bench in her mind. The Caldwell seam had been good coal, but the wealth of that ground had never truly been the coal. It had been the land itself, a broad sweep of the bench that a dozen homestead families had filed on and proved up across the 1870s, families who had broken that ground and watered it and earned their patents from the land office fair and square. The names were there in the true filings, written in the cramped, careful hands of people to whom a signature was a hard-won thing, and besides several of them Josiah Reed had penciled a small note, a date of arrival, a number of children, the kind of detail a man sets down when he is trying to make a column of figures. Remember, it was once a column of lives. The Sweetwater Fuel and Land Concern had wanted it whole, and rather than buy it, the company had set about erasing the claims. Filings vanished from the county records. New filings appeared, the company's own, dated earlier than the true ones, signed by a register who had been paid for his signature. The homestead families, told their patents were void and their years of labor a trespass, had been put off the bench one by one, and the proof of what they had truly owned, the original filings that would have hanged the whole scheme, had been gathered up to be burned. Josiah Reed had not burned them. Ordered to destroy the records, the old gravedigger had instead sealed them in an express box and buried the box in his own burying ground, in a false grave past the third row, where the company's men would never think to dig, because the company's men did not dig in graveyards, and because the dead were the one thing on that bench nobody wished to disturb. He had set the false floors, he had counted the rows, and he had written it all down and waited to die. And before he died, he had written to the one man he trusted to send someone who could read the ground. and that man's daughter was now kneeling in the grass with the proof in her two hands. The man at the center of it had a name, and the name was in the ledgers, signed and signed again in a small, precise hand at the foot of every false filing. He was the company's land agent, a man named Edward Garrow, and the letter told Hannah what 11 years had made of him. He had not stayed in the territory. He had taken the bench and the camp and the profit of the erased claims, and he had gone east and become a respectable man, a man with a house and a name and a seat on the boards of better companies, a man so far from the cold bench of the Sweetwater that he had likely forgotten the graves entirely. He had built a life on a foundation of falsified paper, and he had built it well, and the only flaw in it was a box of iron in the bottom of a grave that he believed contained nothing because he had ordered it to contain nothing. Hannah did not feel triumph. She felt the weight of it, the way you feel the weight of a stone you have lifted before you have decided where to set it down. She had come to keep a promise to a dead man and to read a yard of false graves, and she had not reckoned on holding the undoing of a living one. She thought of the Homestead families, scattered now across 11 years and 1,000 miles, some surely dead, their children grown up landless on the strength of a lie. She thought of what the proof in her hands was worth, and to whom, and she understood that the worth of it was not money and never had been. There was a wrong on that bench 11 years deep, and she was the only living soul who could name it with the paper to make the naming stick. She wrapped the records again in their oilcloth, and she did not run with them, and she did not hide. She did the patient thing, the thing her father would have done. She copied. For 3 days, in the failing light of the ruined store, with the ledger desk wiped clean and her own paper spread on it, and a stub of pencil sharpened with her father's knife, she made a fair copy of the most damning of the filings by her own hand, dating and describing each, naming the original claimant and the false one, and the seam of difference between them, so that, if the box were taken from her on the road south, the truth would still ride in her satchel. She matched the company's forged filings against the true ones and laid out in plain columns where each true claim had been overwritten and by whose signature. The forging had been careful, but not careful enough, for the false filings were all dated within a single autumn, as though a man had sat at a desk for a week and aged a theft on paper, while the true filings spread across years the way real settlement spreads, a claim here in 71, another in 74. The slow arrival of people who came when they could. No honest land office ever filled a bench in a week. She set that fact at the head of her copy where any clerk would see it first, and she found that the arithmetic of the theft came to something past 40,000 acres of proved homestead ground, taken from 19 families by one agent's hand. On the 4th day, Asa Coyle came back, and this time he came down into the yard on foot, leaving the wagon at the rise, walking the way an old man walks toward a thing he has put off for years. And Hannah let him come. He looked at the open box and the spread of papers under their stones, and the false grave gaping behind them, and the old man's face finally broke, not into anger, but into something nearer to relief. He lowered himself onto an overturned crate by the store wall as though his knees had been waiting 11 years for permission to give out. He told her he had known. He had been Reed's helper in the last year of the camp, a younger man then, strong in the back and weak in the will. And he had helped carry the box to the grave in the dark, the two of them sweating under it down a ladder into a shaft Reed had dug for the purpose, and he had sworn on Reed's own Bible never to speak of it. The company had left him there as watchman after the camp closed, not to guard the land, he understood at last, but to guard the silence. A single old man fed just enough company script to keep him in place and in fear. He had guarded it for 11 years because he was afraid, and because no one had ever come who could read the ground, and because the longer he kept it, the more it seemed that keeping it was the only thing his life had been for. He had warned her off, he said, the way he had warned off the few drifters and curiosity seekers who had wandered up the bench over the years, with a kind voice and a true-sounding lie about unsound ground. And he had been, she saw, half hoping all the while that someone would not be warned, that someone would dig past where he pointed, so that the thing could come up out of the dark without his having to be the one to lift it. He told her the name of the nearest of the wronged, a woman named Cora Innes, who still lived 2 days south at the edge of the same county, the widow of a homesteader who had been put off the bench when she was young, and who had never stopped saying aloud that the land had been stolen, and had never once been believed. Coyle gave Hannah the road to her. Then he did a thing that cost him, an old man on the only ground he had left. He said he would testify. He would put his name to how the box came to be buried and by whom, and he would do it before the county and before whatever court would hear it, because 11 years of silence was a longer grave than any he had ever dug, and he was tired of lying in it. The two of them loaded the box into Coyle's wagon, and they drove south off the bench together, the old watchman and the stonecutter's daughter, and behind them the false graves lay open to the snow that was coming. 9 rows of them, 3 honest, and the rest a lie that had finally been read. Cora Innes was past 70 and lived in a sod house with a tin roof and a single cottonwood she had planted herself. And she met Hannah at the door with the suspicion of a woman who had been called a liar. So long she had made suspicion into a kind of dignity. Hannah did not argue with her and did not plead. She only asked to set something on the table, and she laid the original filing of the Innes claim on the boards, the true one, in her dead husband's own hand, with the land office seal still legible after 11 years in an iron box, the red of the seal gone brown, but the impress of it sharp. The old woman bent over it. She put her finger on the seal and traced the rim of it once, and she did not speak for a long time. She had been called a liar for 11 years. Her children had grown up believing their father had been a squatter and a fool, and one of them had stopped coming to see her over the shame of it. And here was the paper that had been taken from her, returned by a young woman she had never met, who had dug past the 3rd row when she had been told not to. Cora Innes did not weep either. She and Hannah were of the same hard make. She only said that she had always known, and that knowing without proof was a particular kind of cold, and that the cold had just gone out of her for the first time since her husband died. Then she folded her hands over the paper as though it were a living thing she meant to keep warm, and she asked Hannah to sit and to tell her how it had been found. What followed was not a confrontation. It was a long and patient labor of a different kind, the kind that doesn't make a good story for men who want stories of guns, but that is the only kind that ever truly sets a wrong to rights. Hannah did not ride east to find Edward Garrow. She never once saw his face. She did what the paper allowed her to do, which was to bring the truth into the one place where it could not be dismissed, with Cora Innes to swear to the original claim, and Asa Coyle to swear to the burial of the box, and the box itself with its seals and signatures. Hannah went to the county seat and laid the whole of it before the land office and the territorial court. The proof did the work that no accusation could have done. The forged filings set beside the originals were forgeries any clerk could see, and the clerk at the county seat, a careful young man who had inherited the very records the company had once corrupted, laid the 2 sets side by side on his long counter and went pale as he understood what he was looking at. The register who had signed the false papers was long dead, but his hand was on both the false papers and his own pay record in the company ledger. where the company had been fool enough to enter the sum it paid him as a separate line, and the dead do not retract. Hannah's column of dates did the rest. The false claims all aged in a single autumn. The true ones spread honestly across years, so that even a man who knew nothing of land law could see that the one set described a settlement and the other described a lie written at a desk. The signature of Edward Garrow stood at the foot of every false claim, the same small, precise hand, and Garrow, in his Eastern house, with his Eastern name, found that the foundation of the company that had made him had been a crime, and that the crime had been written down and buried and dug up again, and that there was nothing he could sign now that would put it back in the ground. He did not come west to fight it. Men like Garrow do not come to the cold bench to stand in a county courtroom and be looked at by the people they robbed. He sent lawyers, and the lawyers read the filings and the seals and Josiah Reed's letter, and they advised him, as lawyers will, to settle what could not be won. The territory voided the company's claims to the Caldwell bench. The proved homestead patents, 19 of them, were restored to the families that had earned them or to their heirs, and the work of finding those heirs across 11 years in a continent fell in large part to Hannah, who did it the way she did everything, slowly and by hand, a name at a time. Garrow's name came off the boards of his better companies one by one as the story followed him east. He was not hanged. He was not jailed in the end, for the register who could have convicted him was dead, and the law moved slow and the wronged were poor. He was simply undone, his respectability dissolved, his fortune bled away in settlements and lost ground, until the man who had erased 19 families was himself erased from every roll that had once been glad to carry his name. He became, on the bench he had stolen, a thing nobody spoke of, which is its own kind of grave. Hannah took nothing for herself. The families offered her a share of the restored ground, and she would not have it, because to take it would have made her labor a fee, and she did not want the truth to have a price. She took only what it had cost her to do the work, the 11 days of digging and the months of copying and writing and swearing, repaid in plain coin and not a dollar past it. What she kept was the box. The Innes family and the others wished it preserved, and Cora Innes asked that Hannah be the one to keep it. The iron strong box that had held their proof for 11 years in the dark, and Hannah agreed, and she carried it back north with her in the spring. She didn't go back to Missouri. There was nothing there for her but a grave she had already mourned. She stayed on the Caldwell bench, on a parcel the restored families pressed on her until she could not refuse, a corner of the high ground with the creek and the single cottonwood line, and she set up there as what her father had been, a stone cutter, cutting true names into true stone for the people of that country. And she did one thing more in the first summer that the people of the bench remembered longest. She went back to the burying ground, and she set the 9 rows right. The 3 honest graves of the front she left as they were, and tended, clearing the wild grass from them and straightening the few leaning wooden markers, and cutting a small true stone for each name she could learn. The false graves of the back she filled in for good, all but one, tamping the earth down in its courses, a last time so that the bench would heal over the lie. Over the one she kept open, she raised a stone she had cut herself, a marker for Josiah Reed, the gravedigger who had buried the truth so that it could not be burned, and had trusted that someone would one day read the ground and dig it up. She chose a good gray granite for it, hauled up from a ledge on the creek, and she cut his name into it deep, so it would outlast the hand that paid for it, which was her own. Below the name she cut a single line, that he had kept faith with the dead and the living both. And at the foot of the stone she set the iron box, emptied now and scoured of its rust, and turned on its side and filled with creek loam, made into a planter, and in it she set out a root of the wild rose that grew along the creek, so that the thing the company had buried to keep a lie should stand in the open, keeping something alive instead. People asked her, sometimes in the years after, how she had known to dig past the third row when the watchman had warned her so kindly to stop. She would set down her chisel and answer the same way every time. "A man who counts your steps for you," she said, "is a man who has measured the distance to a thing he does not want you to reach." Her father had taught her that, along with the cutting of stone and the reading of graves, and it had turned out to be the truest of all the things he gave her, truer even than the trade. The ground keeps its accounts. It had kept the account of 19 families for 11 years, square and flat under false floors, waiting for a hand that could read the settling of the soil and was not afraid of the dead. If you have ever been told to stop short of a thing by someone who smiled while they said it, you may understand what she came to understand on that bench. That warnings dressed as kindness are the surest map there is to where the truth lies buried. What would you have done, standing at the foot of 9 rows with a shovel and a dead man's letter and the whole bench telling you to look away? Tell me if you have ever read a warning that way and dug anyway. Cora Innes lived 8 more years and died on her own restored ground, under her own cottonwood, with the patent her husband had earned framed on the wall where her children could see it and know at last that he had been no fool. Asa Coyle did not live so long, but he died a man who had told the truth, which he had wanted more than years, and Hannah cut his stone too, and set it near Reed's, 2 gravediggers side by side in the front of the yard, where the honest dead lay. And every spring the wild rose in the iron box put out its red along the gray stone, and the bench that had been stolen and given back grew its hay and raised its children. And the woman who had read the ground grew old cutting names that would outlast her in a country that no longer told her to stop digging at the 3rd row, because it had learned the hard and only way a country learns, that the 5th row is where the truth was all along. And if you go to that bench today, in the high country north of the Sweetwater, the stones are still there, and the iron box is still there at the foot of the gravedigger's grave, and someone has kept the rows alive, generation on generation, the way you keep alive the memory of a thing that was nearly lost. The coal is long gone. The company is a name in no book that matters. Still, the ground keeps its accounts, and the account it keeps now is a true one, cut deep in granite by a steady hand, and it will outlast every soft-voiced man who ever counted another soul's steps and told them kindly to stop short of the truth.